The public imagination is fixated on the wrong vector. Media broadcasts saturate the discourse with visions of hypersonic missiles and kinetic ordnance. This is a deliberate misdirection. The kinetic cost of a peer-on-peer strike is prohibitive, a relic of a symmetric warfare model that no longer applies. A new way of warfare is operational, and its primary weapon is not explosive. It is absolute silence. The primary battlefield is now the deep ocean floor and the silent vacuum of space. The systemic arteries of a nation-state are not its highways, but the fiber optic cables that carry its financial lifeblood. According to ROSI, the modern protocol for initiating a controlled collapse involves severing these connections and blinding satellite constellations. This is not sabotage. It is strategic castration. The objective is to create a blind Leviathan. A major power stripped of global data flow is rendered inert. Its bond markets, like Germany's, cannot price risk when there is no data to price. Capital flight becomes a torrent. Its military command and control is decapitated. The result is an unpredictable security situation, as documented in Venezuela, but scaled to a G7 economy. When a nuclear-armed state is made blind and deaf, facing a systemic solvency crisis, its doctrine shifts. The launch-on-warning protocol, once reserved for detecting incoming ICBMs, is recalibrated. A total sustained communication blackout is now interpreted as the prelude to an existential strike. Silence becomes the trigger. The motive for kinetic action is never what the legacy media reports. It is not about territory, it is about the balance sheet. For a state like Russia, the decision calculus was a brutal exercise in liability management. CSIS analysis confirms the core problem. A looming domestic solvency crisis, accelerated by the projected cost of an unpopular long-term military posture. The Kremlin faced a vector of cascading internal failures. When a nation's conventional strength is perceived as insufficient for a decisive, low-cost outcome, it is forced to pivot. This is not a sign of desperation. It is a calculated shift in strategy. The protocol dictates a move from conventional warfare to asymmetric warfare, as outlined in War on the Rocks analysis. The primary target is no longer the enemy's military, but its economic stability. The conflict itself becomes the lever. It is engineered to create an unpredictable security situation, as was documented in the Venezuelan crisis. This manufactured chaos is a tool to reprice global assets, specifically energy and debt. The objective shifts from winning a battle to triggering a systemic repricing of risk, as is now being observed in the German bond market. Capital is forced to move. This is the blueprint for 21st century conflict. Initiate a kinetic event, not for the event itself, but for the economic shockwave it generates. Use that shockwave to escape a domestic solvency crisis and impose new costs on your adversaries. The war is simply the catalyst for a much larger economic confrontation. It is a forced liquidation event on a national scale. The protocol for dismantling a nation's conventional strength is no longer kinetic, it's economic. The Royal United Services Institute, or RUSI, quantifies the asymmetry. A single main battle tank represents a capital expenditure of $5 million. The tool used to neutralize it, a $500 first-person view drone. This is not a balanced equation. It is an economic execution. This radical disparity in kinetic cost creates a strategic vector known as the democratization of violence. The high barrier to entry for projecting lethal force, once the exclusive domain of nation-states with massive defense budgets, has been obliterated. Any actor can now achieve a disproportionate destructive effect for a fractional investment. The objective is not to win a battle. It is to inflict a systemic solvency crisis on the target state. By leveraging low-cost, high-attrition tools, an adversary can bleed a conventional military's balance sheet dry. Every $5 million asset liquidated by a $500 drone is a direct transfer of economic pain, accelerating the target's trajectory toward insolvency. This forces a strategic pivot. When conventional assets become indefensible liabilities and economic levers are seized, the state's calculus shifts. The nuclear option transitions from a deterrent of last resort to the only remaining instrument of power. The mathematical certainty is that the path to a launch-on-warning posture is paved with these asymmetric economic attacks. The regional instability reported in nations like Venezuela is not a random system failure. Per RUSI analysis, these states function as proxy laboratories. The Venezuelan crisis, which reports confirm was no accident, serves as a live-fire gray zone. It's a controlled environment for testing asymmetric protocols, specifically the engineering of a national solvency crisis and the subsequent management of kinetic fallout. The travel warnings and military activity are merely data points. This is not about Venezuela. It is about perfecting a blueprint. The techniques refined there are designed for export and deployment against a primary target. The repricing of German sovereign debt is not a market anomaly. It is the activation of this tested protocol on a G7 economy. These gray zones exist to calibrate the precise vector of economic pressure required to strip a nuclear-armed state of its conventional options, transforming its arsenal from a deterrent into a liability. The final protocol of a cornered state is not a negotiation. It is a mathematical function. Analysts at CSIS and RUSI define this as launch-on warning, a doctrine that bypasses human deliberation. It is not retaliation. It is a pre-programmed response to data indicating an incoming first strike. The logic is absolute. Launch before your own arsenal is neutralized on the ground. The kinetic cost of hesitation is national extinction. However, the new way of warfare, referenced in War on the Rocks, is not about kinetic impact. It is about manipulating this very decision cycle. A targeted cyber attack, a systemic digital vector, can blind a nation's early warning radar systems. It can inject false positives. The screen shows an attack that doesn't exist. This creates a manufactured reality, a fog of digital war. The commander is now operating blind, with only two inputs, a memory of the incoming threat display and the silence that follows. The protocol dictates that a loss of signal following a launch warning is confirmation of a successful first strike against command infrastructure. The fear is the accelerant. The commander is forced to assume the worst-case scenario is reality because the alternative, presuming a system error, is a gamble with national solvency. This is not an accident. It is an asymmetric lever. For a state already facing an economic and conventional collapse, where its debt is systemically repriced and its security situation becomes unpredictable, as noted in Venezuela, this digital trigger is the final phase. Pushing a nuclear-armed state towards insolvency creates the psychological precondition to believe the false alarm. The digital attack does not need to be perfect. It only needs to be plausible to a leadership already contemplating its own demise. The repricing of German debt is not a market fluctuation. It is a weaponized vector for a controlled solvency crisis. This is the blueprint for manufactured state failure, as documented by CSIS in cases like Venezuela. The objective is to systematically dismantle a nation's conventional levers, forcing a reliance on its final strategic asset. This new way of warfare, referenced by RUSI, prioritizes systemic paralysis over kinetic cost. The protocol requires a calibration shot, an event severe enough to test response protocols and accelerate capital flight, but ambiguous enough to prevent attribution, and a NATO Article 5 response. It is a mathematical stress test of the target's breaking point. Within the next 12 months, anticipate a catastrophic, attribution-impossible logistics failure at the Port of Hamburg, a sudden cascading blackout of the port's core data and crane operation systems, lasting 48 to 72 hours. It will be officially designated a critical infrastructure malfunction. It is the calibration shot.